All men hate women, said Claudine. I couldn't just ignore this statement. I mean, most people agree that I am a man, and as far as I can tell, I don't hate my wife. She was angry when she got home because a young male driver had treated her badly on the road. This was the second time a young male driver had treated her badly on the road. She said, he wouldn't dare talk to a man that way. All men? I said, I want to make sure. Yes. If she was right, that would make a lot of sense. Do all men, even the kindest and most forward-thinking ones, harbor misogyny in the deepest parts of their souls? And if that's the case, what can be done? The idea that being a man is now harmful suggests that we've just started to notice. For thousands of years, rigidity and repetition have been part of what it means to be a man or a woman. However, these social structures may be hiding something more basic. Men are what they are because of an unholy mix of psychology and the culture that comes from it. Toxic masculinity is an example of a tautology. The Misogyny Hate Crime Evaluation Report, which was made by 2 universities in Nottingham with help from the police, said in July that incidents of misogyny should be treated as hate crimes by the law and, just as important, by the public. After 2 years of research, it was found that more than half of the women who took part had been threatened, that almost half of them had been groped, that a quarter of them had been followed home, and that a quarter of them had been sexually assaulted. Dr. Loretta Trickett of Nottingham Trent University tells me this has effects on girls and young women. I don't think the boys who do it know how serious it is. When older men harass much younger girls sexually on the street, this is often the case. If I wanted to find this dark matter, that thing inside men that makes them think of women as two-dimensional characters in their three-dimensional stories, I would have to look deep into the unconscious mind, which is a kind of hidey hole. There's a reason why "tell me about your mother" is often used as a shorthand for the vast field of psychoanalysis. Adam Jukes has been a writer and therapist for more than 40 years. For the last 20 years, he has focused on helping men who hurt women. The author of Why Men Hate Women and What You've Got Is What You Want Even If It Hurts believes that childhood trauma and, most importantly, the relationship between a boy and his mother figure shape a man's mind. The mother takes care of the vast majority of people all over the world, Jukes says. There is a difference between how boys and girls grow up. Young boys need to learn how to act like men. Girls don't. Masculinity is not going through a hard time. The problem is with being a man. I don't think misogyny is a natural trait, but I do think it's hard to avoid because of how men grow up. In its most basic form, the theory says that as boys individuate and develop a sense of self, they have to separate from their mothers when they realize they are not like them and they cannot, in Freudian terms, possess them. The Oedipus complex is over because of this repression. In their worry, the boys start to see themselves in the father, and this is where they learn what it means to be a man. Boys' lives are filled with the stereotypes of being a man, being strong, fearless, and competitive, and most of all, not being like the mother. At this point, a part of the male ego is identified with a penis, says Jukes. The whole body can be identified with a penis, and that's when you get masculinity. If it's true, it will make it more interesting the next time a woman tells a man to stop being such a huge jerk. Analysis is a big church with many splits and nonconformists, and Freud's feminist critics have picked apart his theories, especially his ambivalence toward or disregard for the female condition. But 100 years later, even his critics agree that the unconscious plays a role and that boys' relationships with their mothers can be hard. Susie Orbach, a well-known author and psychoanalyst, tells me misogyny is not something that only happens to boys. It comes from how mothers raise their children. Because the mother is the person we depend on the most, anger and fear of being separated from her or fear of her disapproval make us hide it. Girls grow up to be moms, so they learn to feel bad about themselves. But boys don't grow up to be moms, so they feel like they've been stopped, and they feel powerful when they feel like they can stop someone else. It's so hard to understand for a boy. The male child thinks that being dependent on a woman is dangerous, which makes him feel weak and, not to sound like Yoda, afraid, which makes him sadistic. That anxiety is pushed down and comes out as misogyny through the unconscious. Worse still, both Orbach and Jukes agree that a child's behavior is more likely to become extreme as they get older if they had a hard childhood. If you grow up in a very tense home, you'll want to be in a relationship where people are always mad at each other, because that's what love means to you, says Orbach. Your inner experience of a close relationship is one that reminds you of your first and most important love relationship, which is with your mother. When we are very young, we set up our defaults, says Jukes. Our brains are set up to remember pain. So, the species stays alive. We need to go back to the default settings because we feel safe there, in our stress and pain. We think we want something different, but what we really do is set up dramas that make sure we end up back at the default. That's not to say educated and privileged men are less likely to be misogynists. This is classless, international, and trans-historical. Duke says, even in a good family, a child will grow up with chauvinism. Culture and society are the seedbed where the child's misogyny takes root. The construction of the woman as the carer is all around us, and that is part of what informs men's rage with women. In my millennial patients, I don't see any difference to patients I was seeing decades ago. So, there is a sliding scale of masculinity that is usually based on a boy's childhood environment and trauma. All children experience negativity, with indifference or neglect at one end and physical or sexual abuse at the other, and the more painful childhood is, the more likely a boy is to emerge as hypermasculine. The more masculine a boy is, the more he hides how he feels about women. This makes him more likely to be misogynistic and abusive. This also works the other way around, with emotionally weak and even helpless men being more likely to be very masculine. Duke says, I can't tell you how many violent or mean men I've worked with who end up crying and begging for forgiveness. This is very complicated because it turns the person who did the wrong thing into the person who is wronged. However, dependence is at the heart of masculinity, and dependence cuts right through masculinity. It goes against it. Incels, the online subculture of self-hating, involuntary celibates, who define themselves by not being able to find love or a sexual partner, fit this misogynistic pattern very well. In a strange way, these people who say they are losers also act too masculine. The cult-like nature of incels is not a mistake, it is a result of how men's minds develop, a need to control and a sense of shame. It's always someone else's fault. For incels, this starts with the idea that their genes made them bad. Mother Nature, you are a pain. Duke says, the anger and righteousness against women show that they feel wronged over and over again. She won't let me fuck her is about as clear an Oedipal statement as you can make, Sells says. Men are not victims, and incels show the worst in men, like how they don't want to take responsibility for themselves and don't want to get to know themselves or admit what's in their unconscious. Analysts think that this comes from a childhood spent feeling powerless in the shadow of the father, called castration anxiety, and apart from the mother. So, masculinity is a way to protect yourself. Captain Kirk is split in two in the Star Trek episode, The Enemy Within. One version is childish, violent, vain, and sexually aggressive, while the other becomes indecisive, weak, and caring, but not very good at anything. At the end of the story, they decide that the good Kirk needs the bad Kirk to run the ship, so they find a way to put them back together. Even though William Shatner is a great actor, the premise is wrong because the end of traditional masculinity doesn't mean the end of strength, authority, or making decisions. The end of masculinity doesn't mean the end of desire or sex, either, of any variety. In this way, no man is like this. To be a man, you don't have to follow the rules of traditional masculinity, which are to be dominant, tough, and to see women as the other and treat them badly because of that. But how can we break down masculinity and the sexism that comes with it? The experts I talked to all agreed on the same thing. If the problem starts when people are young, then so does the answer. The first step is to stop being dependent on the mother as the primary caretaker. For this to happen, we need to think about what social engineering is good for. The solution isn't to blame mothers at all, says Orbach. It's to get fathers involved in raising children so that the anger, disappointment, and authority aren't all on the mother's shoulders. With the exception of the Scandinavian countries, most countries around the world have terrible paternity leave policies. These stocks can't be used until mothers don't have to carry as much, and women don't have to depend on men for money in general. Trickett says, most of the teachers in elementary schools are women, and I think that's a problem. We need men to show us the way from a very young age. We need to find a middle ground between being caring and being acceptably male. According to the numbers we have, only 15% of teachers in British primary schools are men. There are almost no men working in nurseries. But adding more fathers to a child's life is not a simple cure-all. Orbach says, it doesn't mean we won't be angry or dependent. But they would be fixed, and it wouldn't be shown that girls feel bad about themselves because they've internalized misogyny and that boys are so scared of women that they have to control them. Right now, there is no political will to make these changes. The effects of the traumas that boys and girls will always face could be lessened if there were new ways to help children grow and learn. From a clinical point of view, the goal is to stop seeing things as all good or all bad, says Jukes. You will be mentally healthy if you can stop doing this. This is easier to do if you grow up in a family that loves you and doesn't like masculinity. But that doesn't mean you won't be upset. Stuff happens, he says. But it means you'll be able to deal with the shit well. Masculinity and the misogyny that comes with it are so deeply ingrained that men rarely notice it. It hurts our bodies and minds, and it builds walls that most of us don't even notice, let alone try to see past. Jukes says, the LGBTQ movement is making the case for all of us. In the end, they are fighting this battle for all of us. They are chipping away at these ideas of femininity and masculinity, and if they win, we will all be freed. You can be a man without being masculine, but it will take a long time to get to that happy place. So it can help to ask hard questions like, where do these feelings come from? Am I different with women than men? Is my wife just a bad driver? Might not be the right question. It's hard to start taking apart masculinity, and it's even harder to finish. We can't make this world perfect, but we can make it a lot better.